Hi, everybody, and welcome. I'm Nicole Dumont, Program Liaison here at IAOP. Thank you for joining our Voice of the Customer chapter webinar today on achieving your value proposition with effective SLAs. I do notice there's quite a few of you here today on a guest pass, so I wanted to just take a minute and tell you about IAOP. First and foremost, at our core, we are a member-based association that brings together buyers, providers, and advisors working in collaborative partnerships to learn, network, and ultimately build and grow business. There are two categories of membership: organizational or corporate membership and individual or professional membership. I'll go ahead and put my email address in the chat box, so if you would like to learn more, just drop me an email. Being a member not only makes you part of a really great community, members also have the ability to access problem-solving information in a lot of different ways. For instance, our chapters, one of which you've joined today, IAOP members may attend any and all of our nearly 100 face-to-face and web-based meetings annually as part of a professional membership. If you're not a member, you can attend up to 2 chapter meetings as our guest. But obviously, I would encourage you to upgrade so that you may have full access to IAOP and its benefits. IAOP also connects you to the resources you need, from the UpBox to IAOP's Knowledge Center, Pulse Central, Pulse Magazine. There are always ways for you to access information on the latest trends, best practices, and more. We also have a robust set of recognition programs, including the GEO and the Leadership Hall of Fame. So no matter which stakeholder group you're a part of, you can apply and be recognized. Also, just a little side note, given this is the Voice of the Customer chapter, I wanted to make you folks in particular aware that the nomination process for the GEO, our buy-side award, is opening on July 17th. Also, save the date for OWS 19, February 17th through the 20th, and we will be back in Orlando, Florida. We're working on the program now, and if you're interested in speaking, the call for papers is open until July 17th. We also just released the sponsorship brochure. It's posted on our website if you're interested. For any of you interested in live training and certification, there will be one and only COP Masterclass. This is the last live class of 2018. It's going to be held this summer in Chicago, July 16th through the 19th. So that's coming up really quickly. This training is also available online, and we are excited to announce the summer launch of IAOP Academy. It's going to take our e-learning capabilities to the next level. So be sure to look out for that in the coming months. And lastly, before I turn the program over to the Voice of the Customer chapter co-chair, Sherry Jost, I would just like to cover one housekeeping item. All of the lines, with the exception of the speakers, are muted, so please use the chat box on the bottom of your screen for comments and questions. We'll be monitoring them and addressing them at the appropriate time. Thank you again for joining us, and at this point, I'll turn things over to Sherry.
Okay, thanks, Nicole, and hi, everybody. I'm really pleased that you joined our webinar today because it's such a popular topic for everyone in the industry. Now, our chapter is called Voice of the Customer, and our topics are the items that are on our customers' minds, because this is a customer chapter. And the best way for us to bring our topics to life is to hear different viewpoints on them. And that's exactly what we're doing today. So we have a panel, and we wanted to get perspective on SLAs and other incentives for service performance. And the reason we picked this topic was because down at the OWS Outsourcing World Summit in February in Orlando, SLAs, incentives, performance, service excellence, those seem to be the topics in our Voice of the Customer meeting that were most prevalent. So we're really happy today to have the panel, and we decided that it'd be best to have a supplier, a customer, an advisor, and a legal person, because they all have a strong opinion and experience in incentives and service excellence, and then the topic of SLAs. So I'm very happy to introduce Dave Althoff from Cognizant. You can see his bio on the screen. Alan Hanson from IFG, Lawrence Kane from Boeing, and Neil Hirshman from Kirkland and Ellis. So with that, I would like just each of the panelists to give a 1 or 2 minute talk about service levels in general, what they're seeing in the industry from their viewpoint. So why don't we start with the customer, because this is Voice of the Customer. Lawrence, so do you have a short intro on the topic?
Sure. One of the challenges, and I'm sure folks who sell things to us will recognize this, is that customers tend to, when they outsource, initially start by measuring all the stuff that they measured internally and then adding on top of it. And really that can get dysfunctional, because what matters is what is the business challenge, the value add that we've hired a supplier to fill, and how do we align the motivation of the supplier to support us in a way that gets the value that we're expecting and what we're paying for. And so really SLAs are designed, if they're done correctly, to measure the few key things that really matter and help align that motivation, not to go measure stuff for the sake of measuring stuff, even if it's the things that we've been doing for a very, very long time, because it's really one of those what gets measured gets done kind of things. And they not only get high management visibility, but in most instances, SLAs come with some kind of money attached. It could be a service credit, maybe there's an earn back structure, but the idea is it's really painful for both sides if those SLAs aren't met. So we have to make sure that we're measuring the right thing based on our business need.
That sounds very familiar, Lawrence. I often had the same experience in working with different departments. They would just want their SLAs to be about 30 of their internal measurements. And I really appreciate what you said, is that those probably are not the best SLAs. Okay, David, as supplier, when you're talking with your customer and you face a situation Lawrence just described, you want to tell us what you find?
Sure. So, and I appreciate the time and everyone's time and kind of joining here. So, and I think very much like Lawrence mentioned, from our perspective, it's very, very much in alignment with measuring what matters. But I think also understanding that the definition of what those SLAs are and really how they're used is very important as well. So from the provider standpoint, we build our contracts around those SLAs. And again, as Lawrence talked about, kind of what gets measured gets done. It's also what gets measured gets done, and that's what gets factored into pricing and everything else that goes along with that. So it's not from the standpoint of being able to just say this is all we do, because we were always looking to be better. But that's what we look at and say that is essentially, for lack of a better word, the contracted service agreement, right? That is what we are building ourselves to. As almost everyone here probably knows, you want to get the most value for the lowest cost you possibly can. And you always want to make sure you have the value that delivers what you need from your business standpoint. And that's what we try to use those SLAs for, is to say our view is those SLAs are you telling us this is the minimum that my business must have to operate the way I need it to operate. And then our task as we're coming into those contracting discussions is to say, here's the team that I need to be able to build to those. This is the team I need to deliver on those consistently. This is the team and the cost and what goes along with that to make sure that I'm delivering on the promise that we've made to you. So many times we'll come into those situations and that's what we build out in a, let's say if it's a managed services environment. We'll have a lot of questions at times. We'll say, well, gosh, you guys are meeting all of your SLAs, but we want to do even more. And that's great. We're all happy to try, but there's a difference between we'll do our best to try to do better on something versus I'm contractually obligated to do something better. And that's where then you can kind of run into circumstances of maybe missed expectations and some of those things. And that's important. Again, not because we go down the path of saying, look, I'm only going to deliver what the contract says, but there's cost to everything. And there's cost to, as a provider, saying maybe you want me to add a few more people to try to answer a question faster than the SLA says, or answer a phone faster, or take on more applications than we originally had talked about, or whatever that may be. All of those things have costs to go with them, and from our perspective, it becomes, do we cover that cost as a good partner to you? Is that something that's big enough that you need to cover that cost? And if there's a view that kind of forgets what those SLAs are, many times that can become, well, gosh, why won't you guys just do this? Why don't you want to be better? Why don't you want to get better at this? And we do, but those all have different implications. So I think that's probably one of the biggest things from the provider side, is just truly understanding what do you really want from your business partner? And that's what those SLAs lay out for us, is essentially the roadmap to say, here's what we need to meet. And then beyond that, great partners, we can work on anything that we need to work on, but that's always sort of the baseline that says that's what we're driving to. That's what we're here to ultimately deliver on. If we miss that, that's where penalties come into play. So that really becomes sort of the touchstone and the holy grail for us, to say that at a minimum we must meet. So I think that's probably the biggest shift here as well of things, is where do you go from there, and some of the other ways to look at these also.
Okay, thanks, Dave, for sharing with the customers how the supplier looks at this, and the commitments that the supplier is making to the customer, and how the customer needs to define those very succinctly. So now, Alan, when you're walking into an engagement to help a customer out, and you help establish SLAs and negotiate them, why don't you tell us about your view on SLAs?
Sure, Sherry. Thank you, by the way, for moderating the panel today, and to the Voice of the Customer chapter for picking a topic like this, because it's so pivotal. When I walk into those sort of arrangements, right, as an advisor to the client, but ultimately trying to help both the supplier, the client get to a good place, right, quote unquote, good place. Personally, I come at it with a lens that I've been fortunate enough to be a customer, a supplier, and an advisor. I think I've played every role except maybe Neil's role. Don't worry, Neil, I'm not interested in being a lawyer. But it really becomes about brokering something that will effectively cause the supplier to be incented toward good performance over time, and for the buyer, frankly, to feel like that performance is sustained and good over time. I pick up on Larry's point there at the beginning, that we start with what we know, what were the SLAs that existed before, but things change, right? And very pointedly, things change in the market too. So as we arrive at this topic today, I think it's especially pivotal to think about what's changed in that market. And for us, and when we look at it, there's been the introduction and adoption of a whole bunch of emerging technologies, such as RPA and cognitive, and maybe right behind it, blockchain. And if you look at the performance of a particular business or IT process today, in terms of the speed or the accuracy or even the ability to audit that process as a result of RPA, it might be radically different than what it was a couple of years ago when a deal was struck. So the question is, what are the implications for service level agreements? And then right behind it, some of the knock-on impacts in things like what we think of customarily as year-over-year productivity. Well, is that the right way to think about it, or does it need to be a little bit more structural step change? So I think we have to look at those things and rethink those things as we look at SLAs.
Yeah. Thanks, Alan. What I liked, what you mentioned, is the sustainable over time. And like you said, it goes back to Lawrence's, where if end user department comes in with all their internal measurements, those may be fine for today, but what about 3 years or 4 years down the contract? So I can see the value the advisors bring on guiding people to look at these in a more broader scope. So Neil, after the customers decided to outsource and picked a supplier and got an advisor to help them, and they want to write up the legal contract, what happens at that stage with SLA?
Yeah, thank you, Sherry. Well, first let me just mention that, like Alan, I have the lens and the perspective of being on the customer side and the provider side, but as the lawyer. we as a firm have represented both, so we see things from both sides. You know, service levels, the area of service levels is a fascinating one. As Alan pointed out, it's evolved over the years, but much of the language is the same. You know, measure what's important, but what is important has certainly changed. And I think as an industry, people are focusing much more on the bigger picture, on the business outcomes, the goals. You know, as a lawyer, specific to your question, Sherry, we like clarity, we like certainty. You know, we prefer things that can be drafted in a way that the parties understand what it is they're agreeing to and how to confirm that was achieved. And that benefits both the customer and the provider. And in a lot of ways, service levels provide that because you can have a defined metric, and if drafted properly, the parties know very well whether something has been done or it has not. And that's why we lawyers push for them. But the remedies associated with service levels, the incentives associated with them, they need to match and be significant enough to drive the right behavior and attain the goals. So what we're seeing is certainly in the RFP process, initial stages of the contracting, people relying on tried and true. You know, what are the things you measure today? Let's just pick up on those, drop them into the contract. But we, and as I'm sure Alan's doing this as well, we're pushing both sides to think about whether that's really the right starting point. And certainly it's not the right ending point. And how do we drive everyone to a more modern, sophisticated way of looking at how do we achieve the goals of both parties? We know the providers want to make money. We know customers want to pay less but get great service, but often cases transform their business. And if you rely strictly on the traditional service levels, what have been measured, they don't really represent what the business will need. They may represent what the business used or measured before, but those aren't the same thing.
Well, thank you, Neil. What I always found interesting, it seemed like after limitation and liability and a couple of the other legal terms that the lawyers do so well for the customer, SLAs are one of the hardest parts of negotiation. But like you say, they've been talked about since the beginning of the relationship starting at the RFP stage. So I often wonder, as a lawyer, and you have these different perspectives coming in, can you just tell us a little bit about the SLA negotiation and what could be done to make it easier and less painful?
Well, that's yeah. How do you make it easier and less painful? I don't know if there's a great answer to that question, Sherry, but certainly at the end, what we're trying to achieve is a clear representation of what the parties have agreed to. And there are multiple constituents involved. You have, on the customer side, you have the folks who are not just there at the table, but you have all the people behind the scenes. You have business owners, you have executives, you have the employees who are the users of these services, and doing work in advance to try and identify what those business goals are, what those business outcomes are, so that when the parties get together and are trying to put together what the service levels, or even if not a service level, what the other metrics are going to be to drive the innovation, to drive the transformation, putting that work in up front often will lead to a much smoother negotiation because you have all the information there. You don't have to go reach out to people. You can actually negotiate in that room with all of the necessary background. And then to get things done, you need decision makers at the table for customer and provider, and equipped with all of that background work and information, but they're really to cut the deal. So I think that's an important thing to emphasize for both sides, that the people have to be knowledgeable, they have to be empowered to make the decisions, and the lawyer's job is to facilitate. Obviously we're zealous advocates on behalf of our own client,
right.
but these are these are relationships, these are partnerships. So you do want to make sure that you're developing a framework that's sustainable, that's long-term, that's going to try to help the parties both succeed and achieve the outcomes that they both need and want.
Okay, I like the part where you talked about having the upfront work, and I'm not sure everyone realizes that. And I think that's one of the importance of having COPs and people that have gone through the process many times. The advisors help the client because that upfront work's done to make the negotiation more smooth. Okay, so
Ms. Lawrence, let me add to that, Sherry, if I could.
Sure.
There's not only due diligence that you want to do on the buy side, what are the capabilities of the existing system? What's the business need? What transformation necessary from Supplier and all that sort of thing. So you have clarity of what is capable now, what transformation needs to happen in the future to get to where we need to be. But you can also go to folks like ISG who do benchmarking and find out what's the state of the industry. What are other companies doing in this space for whatever the service or commodity happens to be, and what are standard service levels, and what is the technology that's underpinning that, and how is it changing over time, so that we're not just looking at ourselves, we're looking at what's the industry doing, so then when we're starting to go and negotiate with a supplier, we're not asking for something that's really unusual unless we have a true business need to make something that's unusual. It's those really oddball things that take the really hard negotiations as opposed to something that's more standard to whatever the service is that we're buying. And so that makes folks like Neil's life easier because we know not only what we need, but also what the capabilities are in the industry and where the industry is heading and where those capabilities are probably going to.
Yeah, and one thing. Sorry, this is Dave Althoff as well, and I think maybe to round out that picture as well, even kind of from the provider side, because I do think that research side is very important, even from the level too of understanding. When we talk about like what is the quote unquote market doing, understanding what that market is, right? Because from our perspective, it equates to things like the size of the work that we're doing, the industry that you're in, the history and maturity that you have with providers. The types of providers that you generally use and the types that are kind of included when we talk about a quote unquote market study as an example. And I say that because each of us have different business models of our own, right? We come to the market in different ways. We like to think that we bring different things to the table than others do. And understanding kind of how we interact with our customers, how we work with our customers, that market can trim. And I'll use an example, which is I've had clients before who have said, well, when I compare you to your top 40 competitors, here's where you sit. And from the world of Cognizant, we look at that and say, we don't really have 40 true competitors in the space that we generally sit in. That usually means you've gone down market a little bit into potentially even kind of local staff augmentation firms and others. And there's a very different business model attached to those things. So that understanding of not only doing that research coming in of, where are we, what do we want, how does that stack up against what the market is generally looking for? Also then saying, and what do these kinds of providers bring to the table? Right? So when we talk about that market, it's that view as well, because all of us, I think, are very incented to say, and I think Neil's dead on, there's certainly no magic pill to making the negotiations easier. I really wish there was, having been through it ourselves a lot of times. But I do think we're all incented to get to the point of saying they are very measurable, achievable, deliverable goals to drive the value that you want as a customer. And even kind of the whole point of this conversation being kind of the voice of the customer is really what's driving that, is saying we need to make sure that you, as the people that are asking us for services, understand what your customer needs as well. And is that true 5-9 service levels if you talk about kind of traditional service levels? Or, do I really not need to have every single application up 24/7 every single second of the day? Because there's a whole host of things that go along with that. And then all the way through the other end of the spectrum, and I think what we're seeing happen now in kind of some of the different models of SLAs, or maybe incentive models, if you want to think about it that way, which is things like business outcomes and contracting towards driving increased sales or increasing the customer perception, or all sorts of different measures that actually drive the value for you as a customer, as opposed to just measuring the performance of IT. It's much more moving into that business side, right? So is my perception increasing in the marketplace online? Can you help me drive my consumer scores up? Can you help me drive my profitability and my sales up? There's a lot of things like that we're starting to get into on a pretty regular basis.
Hey, thanks, David. I think you're back to that theme of having a broader view of the customer, which I think is helpful for customers to think about when going through the entire process.
Yep.
I wanted to bring up this metaphor we've heard over the past couple of years called watermelon SLAs. People have coined that term for when they feel that the SLAs are showing green, but they're feeling pink or red or amber. They're not feeling green. So I'm curious from Alan and Neil, I think this is when lots of times customers might come to you and say, what's wrong with our contract, or what aren't we doing right, or what is this gap? So Alan, Neil, you want to comment on watermelon SLAs?
Sure. Neil, you want me to start?
Sure, Alan, go ahead. I'll pick up.
Yeah. And by the way, Sherry, I remember talking with you and Neil and the Chicago chapter there locally about this very topic maybe 4 or 5 years ago. It doesn't go away, right? I think the good news is I'm not even sure watermelon is the right fruit or the wrong or the worst fruit, right? Because at least something appears green. It could be a lot of times when we're looking at benchmarking somebody, as Larry points out, we're looking at an environment. When you dig down, maybe at best performance is kind of yellow on the outside, and inside it's positively acidic. So maybe a lemon's a better one. But there's 3 things I think that go on. I think first, Larry hit it right at the start. We start with the things that we're measuring today, and of course, those can change over time. The second thing that happens is over the course of the agreement, your expectations change. The business users have different objectives. What's important to them has changed over time. So the things that are key obviously need to shift. And there's a dissatisfaction with what you've contracted. But here's the biggest one. I think we were just looking at a large services company globally and doing an assessment for them. And what came out really, really clearly as we went through was there was little or no idea on the business user's perspective, or from the business user's perspective, about what really had been contracted for and what those levels of performance was. So that's one way of saying communication. What the business instead does, and what frankly any of us on this call probably do, this was around IT services like service desk and field services, right? We're influenced by our experiences with Amazon and other, the consumerization of IT. So that's where our expectations are. And if the business or the people using the services don't understand that what was contracted for is fantastically different, might have been perfectly good to the negotiators around the table, might have been really thoughtful at the time, but nothing's been communicated to them, then there's a feeling that things are bad. Or the reverse is, every metric then is good, right? That's the green of the watermelon, but that customer sat is really what the red part's all about. I'm dissatisfied because I don't really even understand what these services are, and certainly they don't meet my expectations. So that's what's really going on with the watermelon thing. And I think over time, people need to transform how they think about the services and put a lot more attention on true CSAT, and are people really happy with what they're getting as opposed to maybe just what's in the SLA?
Yeah, I think Alan's right on, in terms of communication, and I mentioned this earlier in the call about the need to talk to the right people so that you try in the first case to get the right things in the contract. And I know your hypothetical, Sherry, assumes that maybe you did put the right things in, but now people aren't happy, and what do you do about it? One tool, one mechanism is to look to shorter term contracts, or ways to have a renegotiation or accelerated renewals, things like that, because as the needs of the business evolve, those things that you measure, the things that you want to measure, those are going to evolve as well. And what may have been great even 6 months ago, those things have changed. So the ability to sit back down and say, the business has evolved, we've moved more to the cloud, our business is more global, we've moved operations, whatever it is that's triggering different needs, different goals, you have the ability then to sit down and change what it is you are measuring, change maybe what it is that are the things that are going to provide the right incentives for the right kinds of behavior. And then ultimately, you hopefully are doing exactly what Alan said, is driving customer satisfaction, measuring customer satisfaction. And that can come in a lot of different forms and has been called many different things over time. But when you get right down to it, it is a satisfaction metric. Are people happy? Are the executives happy? Are the business users happy? And are the customers of the business happy? Because that, as David mentioned, that will drive additional revenue for the business, conversions of customers if they're visiting a website, uptime and things like that may be easy to measure and may be relevant, but ultimately what is going to drive the revenue is, did the customer who visited that site ultimately make a purchase? Did they remain a user of the business? Did they, if it's in healthcare, are they still an insured? Whatever those metrics are, ultimately measuring the business outcome, that's going to be driven by whether those people are happy.
I hear from you throughout what you're saying, Neil, about the change and how change is going faster and faster. And I think we've just seen that throughout the whole IT industry over the past 40 years, right? That just things change so fast. IT used to be able to plan, if we're talking specifically about IT or even BPO, they used to be able to plan for 3, 5, 7 years out. Now it's getting shorter and shorter that you have certainty.
Yeah, Sherry, the one comment we will make most of these deals is that change is inevitable, and not just in technology, but business and processes, and so you have to base your contract, base your negotiations on that premise.
Yeah.
Right.
Hey, and Sherry, just this is Alan again. Just the nuance there in terms of when we say customer satisfaction. We literally had bought a company in this field because it was really adept at asking a question and then benchmarking the result to this question. Satisfaction with the technology or the experience. So it could be onboarding, it could be the laptop, it could be everything that's presented to the customer, because that's a very different question than going out and asking, are you very specifically happy with the services you're getting from a Cognizant or an IBM or somebody, right? The user, the end user, doesn't really have a way of knowing where the boundaries are day to day. So it's very different to ask a broader question and get insights about it. And I think that's an important thing to start to then incorporate into contracts. And Neil, to your point, we've already seen the duration of contracts coming down, and you hit the nail on the head. That's the reason, because people say that's the only way to really reset the button sometimes in terms of what's really important to us 3 years now.
That's really interesting about how customer satisfaction surveys are changing so that we can get a better picture of what's really going on. Okay, I think we did watermelon SLAs very well. Another topic I had that I'd like to hear from the panel is what are other incentives that you put into contracts, either customer, supplier, advisors, legal? What do you advise? What do you see as good types of incentives along with the SLAs? And I'm thinking the actual mechanism, what type of bonus system or gain sharing, those type of things.
Well, Lawrence, I'll start if that's cool. And
That's
it
cool.
really depends on why are you doing this, right? So we have a supplier stratification process that helps us identify what kind of supplier is somebody. As an example, we have roughly 1,834 suppliers in IT, and 38 of them are actually strategic. So we're going to engage differently. We're going to have the entire contracting process be differently depending on what we're trying to do with the supplier. And so if we're doing a vested type of deal or a high-end strategic kind of deal, we may be doing something very different with the SLAs to help that than we would be in terms of just a commodity kind of a thing. So for instance, suppliers may be in certain categories might have an opportunity to gain additional work based on performance. There's an incentive that's tied to how well they do, which is different than the normal, service credit tied to poor performance, right? It could be something like getting paid based on market share if our goal is trying to grow the business versus something that's tied to an area that's necessary for making us more cost efficient or cost effective. So really going back to that whole, why are we doing this? And making sure that we're aligning everything from the statement of work, the pricing structure, the SLAs, gain sharing incentives. We have an initiative at Boeing called Partnering for Success, which is where suppliers are making specific targeted investments in us so that we can grow together. All of those things play off of each other, and some of the SLAs could become things that are more of, say, an SLO, where it's got high management visibility, but there aren't dollars at risk in certain types of contracting relationships, where in others, we're going to go with the old school route of there's money at stake. We're trying to align the incentive for the supplier to support us this way. The other sort of nuance or extra factor is when you have as many suppliers as we do, they have to play nice together to actually get stuff done. And so we need to be very cautious to hold our suppliers accountable for their piece of the equation, and then incentivize them to play, together with other suppliers to throughout our ecosystem that necessarily supports what we do. And some of those suppliers are internal, some of them are external, but they all need to be working in the same direction to the same playbook. So that's another nuance that kind of overlays that. And we have to make sure that we've got operating level agreements across the various parts and pieces of our supplier ecosystem to make sure that everybody's moving in the same direction.
Wow. So David, after hearing this about an SLO in addition to SLA or an OLA, and this concept of the multi-suppliers, 38 strategic suppliers that have to play nice together. As a supplier, what kind of incentive do you like to see, or do you propose to customers?
Sure. Well, I agree with Lawrence in the sense that it really varies on kind of the role that we're playing. Cognizant tends to be in that strategic supplier category, typically with most of the customers that we have. And what ultimately that I think means to us is we get incented, I guess, as an organization, if you want to think about it that way, by things that move the needle down the path of, in our definition of true partnership. So looking at the partners that we have and the clients that we have and saying, are we continuing to do strategic value-added work? Are we doing more things that maybe are more down the path of again, to Lawrence's point, kind of highly visible programs that move the needle for the business, where Cognizant can be part of that says, here's how we have helped really transform the business that you're in. And in today's digital world, there's lots of different opportunities around that, lots of different definitions of exactly what that is. But that's really, I think, if you look at the truest sense of incentive from our position, it's those things that say, let's drive, deepen, strengthen, and extend the partnership that we have. When it comes to things like maybe some of the more pure dollar figure types of work, those I actually think we look at and say they're relatively limited. And I say that only because more often than not, there's very little upside from the provider's standpoint. Most of those are penalties. They're not things that I can gain. Very few customers actually will agree to say, if I exceed an SLA, I get a bonus, right? So it turns into, if you miss an SLA, you're punished. But if you don't But if you do better than your SLA, I'm going to give you more. I think in probably my entire life, I've had maybe 1 or 2 contracts where that's actually been in place after the negotiations are done. So what that tends to drive is, if you think about it in its worst sense, it only drives you to do just enough and say, okay, if that's how you're going to measure me and that's all you're going to hold me to and try to incent me by, then I'm only going to do enough to get to there. And I personally believe that is a big impact on the watermelon effect we talked about before, is you start to feel bad as a customer because you just don't feel like you're getting anything more. You start to hear, no, for lack of a better word, more often, because it becomes, well, could you help me with this? Could you invest here? I need some more critical thinking in this area. Could you help me with that? And those kinds of conversations in and of themselves are exactly what we want to be having. But if through time the relationship has been developed into one of measurement and pure measurement against penalties only, as opposed to true incentives, that's where I think things start to become a little bit of conflictatory, if you will, from that perspective. And so I think as we look at those, we do look at things, and we do a lot of work as well around things like joint partnerships and in true investments where we will invest in the operations. I think there's a moving away a little bit of SLAs into truly the business objectives, and MBOs, we're kind of calling managed business objectives, where we actually have clients that we are paid, and essentially we are paid by how much business we've driven for them. The change in their customer perception, depending on the work that we're doing, right? If we're doing things that can influence that. So I do think and Neil mentioned this before, and I think Alan did as well, there really is a bit of a pretty significant shift to what it is that I think our customers want from us. And a lot of the things that in the past were the core of what we did, which for lack of a better word was, labor arbitrage for lower price to meet a level of keeping my systems up and getting so much work flowing through the pipeline. That shifted to say, look, that's table stakes anymore. We have to do that, and we have to do that well. But really where you start to see our clients starting to push is to say, how do we incent and help you move to move the needle with us? How do we bring real advisory services to the table, especially because the services have, and I think Neil mentioned this before, as Alan did as well, which is the services have changed dramatically, where the contracts now cover infrastructure and application development and legacy maintenance and consulting services and advisory services and digital services and business process operations and all of those things. And they're all becoming so tightly integrated, driven by the technologies that now allow us to do some of those things, that the incentives and the views of how we measure our performance against those really change pretty significantly.
Hey, Sherry, it's Alan. If you'd like, I'll throw out an example, I think, of what Dave is.
Sure.
So he's spot on. Most customers won't entertain a contract that has incentives to it, particularly if they're open-ended gain share type things, right? It just puts them in an odd spot. They'll talk about it maybe at the beginning of a contracting exercise, but by the end, typically that's gone off the table. We had one where we did for a mortgage company or a financial services company, a large contract, and they were particularly interested in incenting performance, but it turns out a lot of that was because of some of the past institutional history with the prior provider, right? And what we did was really focus on those things that were important to them to incent. We wound up with a contract that had both conventional SLA methodology for the largest group of performance indicators, but there was a particular set of activities where it made a lot of sense to put in place incentives. So what emerged was a contract that really had SLA methodology and incentives that coexisted side by side. That was yesterday, right? Today, I think this concept of having MBOs on the table and talked about early is much more prevalent. How you get there is different. I talked earlier, right at the outset, about RPA, and using a real world example, right? If we know from our experience implementing even what you can achieve. So if you took a trading process and you turn the turnaround time increases by 90%, or the accuracy goes to 100%, well, you can't have SLAs that get better and better each year, but you can have SLAs that would be different today than they were yesterday. And then, oh, by the way, you might have some actual capital impact where you're able to reduce the amount of capital that's lost through errors and so forth, it's not operating savings, right? And so if we're generating $1 million to $10 million worth of those kinds of gains every quarter or every month, then that's something that a service provider might really be interested in participating in the upside, particularly if they're able to bring some real acumen and attention to it through cognitive and other tools. So I think the discussion is shifting. I don't know if the overall willingness is there to contract in that way, but I think clients are very interested in how to better align to their business objectives.
Yeah,
Okay,
let me jump in, Sherry. Oh, sorry,
Sure.
Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to thank both Dave and Alan for bringing up to me a new concept of this managed business objectives and trying to get that into the contract as opposed to just SLAs. So yeah, go on, Neil.
Well, I was going to complement what they were saying in terms of these business objectives and measuring outcomes. And we're working on a deal now where the provider is very much willing to put fees at risk for metrics around increased revenue or increased EBITDA, or even in a public company, an increase in the share price or market cap for the customer. But one of the challenges is the control that the provider has over certain decisions that are made at the customer. So the more a provider is putting at risk, at least this is my experience, the more concerns they obviously have about their ability to control their own destiny. If you turn, as a customer, if you turn everything over to the provider, and the provider says, I can manage this particular IT function or process this number of accounts, or it's something that you could point very clearly to the inputs and say, if customer doesn't give me this in time, there's no way I can hit my timeliness. But if the customer does, then I control as the provider everything after that, and I can actually meet all those levels. Where it becomes fuzzier is when those business decisions are really left with the customer, and provider is dependent in large part on how marketing is done, or how decisions are made about what the website looks like, or taking things in a different direction. So balancing those risks, it's challenging. I think it's a good direction to take things, but it is challenging from a contract perspective to give the provider enough control, enough outs, if you will, while still putting enough of the fees at risk so that the incentives are there for the better performance, the transformational activities, the innovation that you're trying to drive. And just as a lawyer, as the one lawyer on the panel, and Alan, no, I don't feel threatened. Maybe you'll take the bar one day, but for now, I'm the only lawyer speaking. That's a challenge for us, because we, as I said at the beginning, we like the clarity and the certainty. We like to define things, because ultimately that's what the clients, whether our customer or provider client, will come back to us and say, what does the contract say, and has performance been met? Have they been satisfied? And we need to be able to tell them this is what it says, and yes or no.
Wow, very well said. Balancing these risks. And I think that links back to what Alan was saying, that at the beginning of just talking in general conceptually, oh yeah, there's going to be all these kind of incentives, but by the time you get to contracting, they're hard to get into the contract. So it sounds like that's the challenge, Neil, that you and your colleagues face with helping the customer get, and a supplier, define those so that it's basically fair to both sides. So I had one more question, and you guys have already touched on it. I wanted to start with our advisor and legal, because they're seeing a wide variety of customers and suppliers, and just talk, and like I said, you touched on it, or you've even gone into depth on the MBO, but and then go on to Dave and Lawrence, how customers and suppliers, what kind of trends are you seeing in performance incentives, including SLAs? any trends that are new ideas that us customers can take back to our jobs.
Yeah, so Sherry,
Alan or Neil?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I think two things. Number one, a much earlier, I was going to say that Neil used the word upfront earlier, but it's two words right up front. A much more upfront collaboration session with the supplier where it's less about, here's what I'm doing today, how will you do it tomorrow for less, than having an innovation session right up front. Dave made the point earlier that providers are not all the same. They bring different things, capabilities, IP, platforms to the table. And having more collaborative solutioning up front ultimately leads them to tackle things like, well, how could we perform this better? How could we perform it differently? And what kind of decision making would we frankly need to be able to have in order to do that better? So I think it's less about focusing purely on the SLA as it is about focusing on what is it that the business is trying to achieve, and letting the suppliers be able to provide a little bit more innovative approach. And when you get 3 or 4 of those, it becomes very interesting to try to evaluate, but I think it leads to a contract that ultimately can align much better and achieve much better performance. So I think that it's really about the cadence and the process and less about the contract that emerges from it, but it starts up front.
Yeah, and I think then when you hand it off to the lawyers, the challenge is to document as best you can what it is the parties have in fact agreed to measure or do. And I give you one example, a deal we had where the customer and provider were betting on the results of certain transformation projects. That is better service, lower cost, all of that was tied to certain things, technological innovation, transformative efforts, moving to a different system, things like that. And thinking about what the to-be environment would look like. But unfortunately, given time constraints and budgets and extrinsic factors, insufficient time was spent on defining all of those details, and that they were put off until after contract signing. And basically the parties agreed to negotiate in good faith. I'm sure most of the people listening or those panelists here have heard that expression and have seen it show up in contracts, and it certainly has value. But ultimately it just puts off to another day the discussions and finalizing the deal. And so what ended up happening was the customer was disappointed about how long the transformation project took and actually what came out of it, and the level of contribution that was required from it. And the provider was disappointed by the effort that the customer put into it and the cooperation, and ultimately the money the provider had to put into it in order to achieve the goals, which themselves were perhaps not as clear as they could have been because the parties didn't spend the upfront, to pick up on Alan's expression, didn't spend it up front trying to figure all of that out. And so regardless, I guess the point, Sherry, is regardless of what those are, what those incentives are, speaking as the lawyer, the more time that is spent up front trying to define all of those things, the clearer the contract is, and then ultimately the happier everybody is at the end, because they can point back and say, yeah, that's exactly what we agreed, and yeah, it's been achieved. Or if it hasn't been achieved, you can point to something and say, well, we need to drive that. We need to drive that behavior. Here's what you're supposed to do. It's clear, it's black and white, and let's get it done.
Thank you. So our last 4 minutes, can we hear from the supplier and the customer on the same topic that Alan and Neil just really covered well? What incentives do you like to have for your company, for the supplier, for the customer, and any trends you see?
In the true spirit of the voice of the customer, I'll allow Lawrence to go first.
Oh, thank you.
You're such a gentleman, David. Thank you. I'm not going to speak to specific metrics, but I will say that when we need to get innovation as part of a deal, it's really important to not do a traditional RFP and rather use ISG's RFS process, or if you want to talk vested, the request for partner, something where you have the ability to collaborate with the bidders and understand how are you going to solve my business problem in a unique and interesting way, and how do we measure that it's truly been actually resolved, and that I'm getting more value or more speed to market or transformation or whatever it is that I'm trying to do. And by having that higher level of input from the supplier instead of the old school, yea, verily, thou shalt, and here's how we're going to measure it, then figure out what the right metrics are.
Yes.
And David, you want to wrap it up?
Sure. And I think Lawrence is kind of spot on with, as kind of I mentioned before, in the world that we as providers want to live in, which is we do want to be looked at as truly a value-added partner and someone that helps you solve those problems. And we call it a lot about shifting left in the decisioning, which is, in simplest terms, if we're living in a world where you've already decided, here's my problem, this is what the answer to it is, here's how I'm going to deliver it, this is what I need to do, and then here's where I need one or two of these widgets from you, supplier X, we're in the wrong spot, right? We look at that and say, that's nothing more than an order taker. And I think what our clients are asking for out of us is be someone who helps me solve my problems. And understanding what that is earlier on and being more upfront, more on the left-hand side of that, if you will, in the conversation around starting with what is my problem? Here's my problem. And allowing us to be able to bring to the table, here's how we've addressed similar situations like that with a multitude of clients. Because the one thing that we do have that most of our clients don't is we do have the experience of having done this with, several hundreds, if not thousands of clients. We've done similar work. I can look across industry groups. I can look at my peers across multiple different areas and try to solicit ideas of where we've done some unique things to address some pretty specific problems and how do we bring those to the table. And then maybe the last kind of summary of this whole conversation becomes, in a relatively unique way, I think what we try to do is split work into kind of two different pools, if you will, today, especially in today's world of kind of the digital transformation side, that says most of our clients are looking at kind of keep the lights on type of work or the table stake stuff and saying, I want to reduce how much I spend there because I need to increase the amount I spend in transformational things. So what we try to do with a lot of our clients now, and in some situations where we have contracts that exist, we work within the frame of that contract and say, let's just push that to the side for the moment and we'll keep delivering the stuff that's in there. But let's talk about how much money you spend in this area. And what we'll try to help you do is let's define some targets that say, I'd like to reduce that by 15% or 20% in order to move it over to the right-hand side, if you will, around how do I really transform my business. So what we'll do with a lot of them is try to identify specific opportunities that say, here's what we'll do. Much of the time you spend a lot of your budget on us to be able to maintain what you currently do to keep the lights on and do your traditional services. So we'll try to find commitments that say, we will find a way to optimize that, eat into our own revenue, which we're fine with, specifically if that means we have the opportunity to work with you on the other side of the equation that says, let's talk about that digital side, that transformational side. I'm happy to do that if I know that there's more value added, longer term, to be honest with you, work that strengthens our partnership with one another, as opposed to work that just puts me specifically and solely in the spot of a IT provider, right? That is an interchangeable part. And anything that I can do as a provider to move myself to a stronger position of being really looked at as a partner by my clients is what I want to do. That's really what's going to incent us to do the best we can do, even if that means eating into our own revenue streams, because we know that's not the strategy for you. That's not where you want to spend your dollars. We know that. And the more we can do to say, let's optimize that, let's pull those dollars down, let's make that work more efficient, let's automate as much as we can so I can shift those dollars to more strategic things. As long as I can be part of that conversation, I'll do everything I can do to make that happen.
And that's a great note to end on. I really enjoyed the discussion, the themes that came across of collaboration, upfront work, this MBO concept. You guys really enlightened us on what's going on in the industry from all four of your perspectives. And thank you to the panelists for enlightening us and sharing your knowledge with us today. It was great. Thank you.
Thanks, Sherry.
Happy to do it. Thanks, Sherry.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Bye-bye.